So after releasing a video I produced about Landback with comedian Cliff Cardinal, I realized that this topic deserves some deeper insight. It deserves an expert to weigh in, which is why I am super excited I got to speak with Bruce McIvor. Now, how would I describe Bruce McIvor? Luckily, I have some notes here to lead me along because his resume is long and illustrious. He's a historian, he's a lawyer, he's an author, he's a Fulbright Scholar, he's a professor of constitutional law, a board member of Amnesty International Canada, and a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation. He dedicated his career to defending and advancing Indigenous peoples' inherent and constitutionally protected title rights and treaty rights as a partner at First Peoples Law. And so I am super stoked that he took the time to speak with me. Frankly, that he gave me the time of day speaks to his character. We talked about Landback. We talked about how the Canadian government defines indigeneity. And we also talked about the Coastal GasLink pipeline and his clients at the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. And I know if you care about reconciliation, if you care about climate change, if you care about justice at all, you are going to enjoy this conversation. So, and you know what? He's one of the funniest people I've talked to. He's so funny. So it was great to see his sense of humor, and we had a great conversation. Just so you know, we recorded it on June 29th, 2023, just before Canada Day. So I hope you enjoy. You have a gorgeous background of books.
Giving a little plug for my friend Michelle's book there. So
I see that. Always very nice. People put it like... Just like, hey.
I'm a bit embarrassed when I see people plug their own books.
Don't worry, we'll plug your book. Don't worry, we'll plug yours.
No, but it's like, don't do that, man.
Pay it forward.
I saw this guy, he had like his whole background was just copies of his book.
Oh my God, that's so cringy. I do like the idea of someone eventually just taking their own book and holding it in front of their face the entire time and just being like, just answering questions, being like, so, as I say in the book.
You could do it where the lips
right in your mouth.
Move. You can see the lips.
Yeah, just cut a hole right through it.
I watched the Cliff Cardinal Landback piece. It was great. That was hilarious, and it's a nice combination of substance and humor, right? I joke a lot. I have a lot of Indigenous friends do this work, and they often talk about how the way to do it is you got to start off with a joke, get people to laugh, bring them in, they kind of open themselves up, and then get them.
Yeah, and then you stick them with facts. And then their heart goes, ooh.
Exactly. It's like they open up, they kind of lean in nice and warm. And
here's a fact. Ow, my heart. My heart hurts with that fact. But then you start to think and reevaluate.
Yeah, exactly. No, so that's, I don't like to stereotype, but it tends to be a very Indigenous way of doing those things. It's great. Yeah.
Let's kick it off. If you can give me an introduction, just your name, what you do, what's your book?
Bruce McIvor. I'm a partner at First Peoples Law. We're a firm with offices Ottawa and Vancouver. We just represent First Nations across the country. I've got a book out called Stand Off: Why Reconciliation Fails Indigenous People and How to Fix It. But my current claim to fame, as far as I'm concerned, is that recently the National Post described me as a radical extremist. And I was, finally, I've achieved something. I'm very proud of that.
Wear it as a badge of honor.
Exactly. I'm very proud.
So maybe you can just tell me what kind of law First Peoples Law practices and the kind of cases that you typically take on.
So we do a whole range of law for First Nations. I myself, I specialize in constitutional law for Indigenous people in Canada. So as you work and become more focused as a lawyer, I've turned into a total nerd specializing in Section 35 and 9124 of the Constitution. I don't know much else outside of that. And that leads me to do work for Indigenous people defending their Aboriginal title and rights and treaty rights. I do a combination of litigation, negotiation, so kind of carrot stick type of work. And I'm really fortunate. I have clients all over the country. I spent a lot of time flying. I think it's June, I've almost made my super elite already on Air Canada, which is not a good thing. But yeah, so I'm all across the country doing this work for different Indigenous people. And I'm really honored to do that. Personally, I live out in Vancouver now, but I'm originally from Manitoba. So my family is one of the Métis families from St. Peter's in Manitoba. That's not where I was raised myself. We were part of the displacement of the Métis. We ended up being moving a few hours north of there. And so I was raised in where there's a lot of rocks and a lot of swamp. And my family tried to farm up there. And that was ultimately what led me to become a lawyer, because I didn't want to pick rocks anymore. So that's what leads me here.
This actually dovetails great into my next question, because in your book, Standoff, Why Reconciliation Fails and How to Fix It, you have a great discussion about your own Métis family history, and then the challenges of creating legal definition of indigeneity, rather. Maybe you can tell us a little more about how you understand your identity.
Thanks. That's a really important question, particularly now with all the harm and violence that's going on across the country because of pretendians, the harm that's being done to Indigenous people. For myself, I wasn't raised with that as part of who we were. It was part of who we were, but not talked about. And so that's pretty typical with a lot of Métis families, particularly those that weren't part of the French Métis, more of the Scottish Protestant Métis. So we were, back in the 19th century, we were the half-breeds referred to. So that's part of the effect of colonization. That's it's done to Indigenous people, and much, much worse than my particular family's situation, because Indigenous people who have been stolen away from their families by the state, Indigenous people that are forced to go to residential schools and so forth. It's all part of that process of disconnecting Indigenous people from the land and who they are. And it's really important to have a space for Indigenous people to come back again. I see a lot of young Indigenous people struggling with that, and that's what really concerns me about the pretendian situation, because they end up having this lateral violence perpetuated against them. It can be quite ironic, because what happens, and I can see why, you'll get some Indigenous people will have a status card from the federal government, which is a totally sexist, racist system of colonizers deciding who you are. But at the same time, there's a level of comfort there. There's a level of protection. And you do get some people with status cards hold that up. See, I am Indigenous. I have one of these status cards. And yeah, okay, fine. But you do have to realize that, and I'll ask people this, do you have cousins or nephews or nieces that can't get a status card? Oh, yeah, I got lots of those. Well, think about it, right? Does that make them less Indigenous? No. It's part of the problem with the colonial project. So it's really important to recognize it. I think call out the people that are there and claiming Indigenous identity falsely and doing a lot of harm. I think it's important to call those people out, but it's also really important to recognize that there are a lot of Indigenous people struggling to find their way back again because of no fault of their own, and to respect that.
So how does the Canadian government try to answer the question of what does it mean to be Indigenous? What are the ways that they go about making that definition? Right.
It's changed, I think, to a certain degree over the last few years, while they'll still impose the status card, and that if Indigenous people want certain recognition of their rights, it's a lot easier if they can if they can get a status card. Often in negotiation situations, though, federal government officials will recognize, well, you do get to decide who the members are, who the citizens are of your nation. And they'll support Indigenous people at certain times doing up their own citizenship laws. So they will support that. That's a positive thing. But at the same time, what I see is government officials will say, well, we'll support that to a certain extent. It can't be to the point where, one, you disentitle anyone who's already on a ban list. So you've got to recognize those people as part of your nation, which most of the time is okay. But sometimes there's people on the ban list where my clients will basically say, who the hell are those people? We don't even know who they are, right? They can end up on a ban list based on a decision by a federal government official in Ottawa, but it doesn't really mean that they're recognized necessarily as part of my client's nation. So that can be a problem. And secondly, where I see the federal government get wound up the most about this is, well, we can't have any double dipping. So don't think you're going to get any benefits from the federal government on that ban list and then go off and be on another one where you might get similar benefits. So that's a problem. And the last one is that they are reluctant to recognize Indigenous people can be citizens of more than one nation, right? They're reluctant to do that. It's a bit ironic because Canada is one of the countries, as you know, that do allow dual citizenship. So they recognize that, and they'll criticize other countries for not recognizing their dual citizenship, but they will not recognize that in most cases that I've seen, at least, for Indigenous people.
So you were speaking a little bit about benefits there. I was once in a Tim Hortons outside of Sudbury, and I overheard a guy complaining about like all the free stuff Indians get. Like,
yeah,
it's just like, did you know every one of them gets a free truck? Yeah. And I guess my question is, which truck did you get? Which did you get the F-150? Like,
you get to choose the
color. Which color did you get? Which Canadian truck? Anyway, obviously, seriously, I mean, there's a whole lot of misconceptions about like taxes, especially.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the justifications for kinds of exemptions and other benefits that there are, and like why they exist, and sort of clear up some of that nonsense.
Yeah, it is nonsense, and it's obviously nonsense, but it's nonsense that's used as a tool to oppress and disentitle Indigenous people. I don't think we can just dismiss it as nonsense. You see it all across the country, and it's used as a tool, right, to oppress Indigenous people, to deny their rights. That's what it does. So I always tell non-Indigenous people as much as possible, when you hear that kind of stuff, if it's a safe situation, say you can hear it around your kitchen table with members of your family sometimes. I think it's important to call it out. And I think when it comes to that all Indigenous people get all these benefits all the time, it's not true. That's important. Secondly, it's important to realize, this country, which is one of the most wealthy countries in the world, and the quality of life of so many people, not all, but so many people, is based on the wealth of Indigenous people. It's based on their land. That's what it's based on. So you have these people driving big trucks, non-Indigenous people in places like Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie or somewhere else. I wonder where they're working. They might be working at the mine. They might be working in the forestry industry. They got a good job that pays for that big truck. Whose minerals do you think those are? Whose trees do you think you're cutting down that's supporting your quality of life, right? I think it's really important for people to understand that, and this wasn't done through an agreement with Indigenous people. That's what you get. So like, they just decided, to surrender all the trees and all. No, that's not true. That's just another lie. It's another violent lie that's told about Indigenous people. On the tax situation, that's another one. You hear it all the time. I used to give talks to non-Indigenous groups on how that's a total myth, right? Indigenous people don't pay taxes. They pay a hell of a lot of taxes. There are certain situations, very narrow, where their income may be tax exempt, but very narrow. And it does an injustice to a lot of Indigenous people, because the way the courts have interpreted this is that you have to be connected directly to a reserve. And so Indigenous people who are trying to develop different businesses, jobs in different industries, if they move off reserve in a lot of situations to have those jobs, sorry, you don't get that tax exemption anymore. And the courts take a very narrow view. What you see is the Supreme Court will explain what the principles are. And then over time, the lower courts, the tax court, the federal court, narrow, right? And that's part of this myth, is that Indigenous people don't deserve this tax exemption at all. It's important for non-Indigenous people to know that's Canadian law. I thought this is a country, the rule of law. Woo, the rule of law. Well, that's a decision made by the Canadian Parliament. It's in the Indian Act. It's there. I thought we were a rule of law country. And there are other groups that also get tax exemption all the time in different forms. And yet there's this focus on Indigenous people that somehow that's unjust, that's unfair, and they're enriching themselves. Well, I just invite those people, spend some time just researching what the social economic situation is for a lot of Indigenous people, and then come back and tell me that somehow they're benefiting unfairly from the tax exemption.
With the video that I produced with Cliff Cardinal about landback and colonization, we're trying to make the argument that it's something that Canadians should be supportive of. And I noticed a lot of people in the comments taking it as like a personal attack. Like, what if my parents are immigrants? Or like, I'm 20, I didn't do colonization. Mm-hmm. So what is your response to Canadians who feel personally attacked by the mere discussion of colonization?
Yeah, I think it really shows that there's a vulnerability there, that when they start thinking about it, they feel really uncomfortable. And then they lash out because of it, because it's truth-telling. Truth-telling can hurt particularly for people in positions of privilege and entitlement. It's uncomfortable to be told what the basis of your wealth is on, right? When you tell people you are seeing your property values go up and up and up and up. Well, you know what that's based on? A total lie. Whoever gave anyone in your family or anyone else or who you bought that property from the right to sell that, the right to own it? There's no deed of sale there from Indigenous people. It's all based on a fundamental lie. And that really makes people uncomfortable. But the land back is vitally important because it calls out that question. And then it calls out people now to take responsibility. I have no time at all for when people say, well, that's part of the past. I'm not a colonizer. Maybe I'm descended from colonizers, but that's part of the that's a historical relic. No, it's not. You are a colonizer. If you're not an Indigenous person from the land, you are a modern day colonizer. I don't like this talk about settlers. That really annoys me, this settler Indigenous binary, because the idea with that is that somehow the land was unsettled. It was wilderness. It was uncivilized. And now the settlers come and they bring civilization. No, you're not a settler. You're a colonizer. That's what you're doing. And you're part of the modern day colonizing project called Canada. So just take responsibility for that and recognize it. If you do it, then you're making a real step forward on so-called reconciliation. But until people recognize that, we're not going to have any reconciliation because we'll be perpetuating a lie. And so that's what's really important. Truth telling is uncomfortable. Suck it up. That's my advice.
You were talking about who gave you the bill of sale, who gave you that. Well, what do Canadians need to know about the Doctrine of Discovery?
Yeah. So the Doctrine of Discovery is basically this legal principle that colonizers can show up, plant a flag, and magically obtain an interest in the land, in Indigenous land, own the land, and displace Indigenous people's own laws. That's it in a nutshell. And it's based on the intellectual basis or the papal bulls from the 15th century, that initial period of colonization of the Americas and the Vatican dividing up the so-called New World between these colonizing powers. It then became the intellectual basis for the law, first in the 1830s in the United States, when the Supreme Court there said, hey, how in the world did we ever get title to this land? That's a good question. Let me think about it. And Chief Justice Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court developed this doctrine, saying, well, it's based on Europeans came and discovered it. And so that gave them the right. And it's based on the fact that Indigenous people were savages and Europeans brought civilization. So that's part of that early 19th century American law. In Canada, what a lot of people don't appreciate is that made its way into Canadian law. First in the late 19th century, but then really importantly, it's at the core of the constitutional protection of Aboriginal rights. In Canada, we often like to think, oh, well, we're such an enlightened country. Unlike the Americans, we have in the Constitution, our Constitution, protection for Aboriginal rights. Well, it sounds okay until you start looking at how the court framed this up in Canada. And so when the Canadian Supreme Court started to grapple with what is this protection about, they started from the basis and they said, no one's ever questioned that Canadian sovereignty is held in Parliament in the colonizers, that the land, the title to the land is held by the colonizers. No one's ever questioned that. And of course, I put up my hand. Well, I can think of a lot of people who have questioned that. Actually, you don't want to question it. Okay. And the court has basically said, we can't, because then we'd be questioning our own authority to sit here on this bench in these fancy red robes and make decisions about Indigenous rights. We can't question it. It's like having a car and the engine's hammering away. It's probably low on oil, but you don't lift up the hood. No. We'll just keep driving along, as fast as possible. So that's at the very center of Aboriginal law in Canada. We're Canadian. We use euphemisms all the time. So we don't like saying doctrine of discovery. So in Canada, the term we use is assertion of crown sovereignty. Most people wouldn't know what in the world that means, right? But that's basically the discredited, racist doctrine of discovery principle.
Assertion of crown sovereignty. It's basically like, this magic hat says we're a country.
Exactly. That's what it's about. And in until recently in Canadian law schools, that was taught, that's taken for granted to a large degree. I think most lawyers or future lawyers graduating from law school still believe that. That's what they understand, is that all lawmaking authority, it sits in the provincial or federal governments. They get to make laws and decide it all. And my clients and Indigenous people all across the country go, wait a minute. We were making laws a hell of a long time before your ancestors showed up here. And we still have that law-making authority. It's just that you're denying it. You're not allowing us the space to make those laws. We still have that law-making authority. And part of what this reconciliation project should look like is recognizing that fact and creating that space for Indigenous people to exercise their own laws.
So the Pope recently repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. So that means that Canada is canceled, right?
Yeah, it's not the case. It's been misrepresented that there was a repudiation of the doctrine by the Pope. That's not how I read the statement that was put out from the Vatican. What the Vatican, I think, basically said was, one, we never really meant any of that stuff about you savages, and that's never been part of our teachings. It's those bad colonizing countries misinterpreted our words and misapplied them. Isn't that unfortunate? And so that's what this statement, I think, if you read it, I don't think I'm being unfair, is largely about. It's pointing the finger at someone else.
Okay.
I really find that frustrating. I really find that infuriating, because as we're talking about, the first thing is telling the truth. And as far as I'm concerned, I myself was raised Catholic. I remember sitting in that little church with all the statues and Jesus looking down on me. Tell the truth. Confess your sins. Well, I don't see the Pope doing that. I don't see the Vatican doing that. I see it as passing the buck, blaming it on someone else. The church should be telling the truth first of all. And part of that truth telling is that it's not part of the historical past. The Catholic Church in Canada and across the Americas continues to benefit from that lie. They continue to benefit from it. So what are you doing now? That's what I would ask the Pope. What are you doing? Don't just make this pseudo repudiation, pseudo apology, because that itself can be weaponized against Indigenous people. That's what you often see with these so-called apologies. It turns into a narrative where the same kind of people perhaps you overheard at the Tim Hortons in Sudbury would be sitting around saying, what are these Indians complaining about? We apologize, get over it. And so that's part of the violence against Indigenous people. You see that all the time. It's meant to silence them. It's meant to press them. And so it's really important. No, tell the truth, first of all. Don't pass the buck, blame someone else. Second, what are you doing? What are you doing, Pope? Now, and I call out Catholics for that. Okay, stop looking to Rome. What are you doing? What is your diocese doing? What is your church doing? After the Vatican made that announcement, I got a few calls from churches. Hey, what can we do to give land back? Wow, good. Not one of them was a Catholic church.
So how would you describe the land back movement to someone who thinks that it's all about guys with guns coming to take your expensive Toronto house?
Yeah, it's not about that at all. It begins with the truth. And so that's most important. Land back across the country is calling out this lie, this underlying lie that somehow Indigenous people gave up their interest over the land, their rights in the land. It's calling out that lie that the Canadian state is based on. So that's important. And then it's putting the responsibility on non-Indigenous people to say, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do? If you're going to move forward in a meaningful way, you have to tell the truth, and then you have to make reparations. This is a conversation that's not fully developed in Canada. There's south of the border in the States, a lot more of a conversation about reparations. What about reparations? I was at a conference in Ottawa a few years ago, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was giving a talk, and I didn't realize it, but there was an open mic for questions after she finished. Well, you might be surprised how fast I can move. I was up there in a flash because I've been in the Supreme Court before, and I've had her asking me questions. Hey, now I get to ask a question. And that was my question. What about reparations? And I think it really comes down local, to the local level. There was in the city of Victoria has had this plan when they send out the yearly property assessments. It's not going to be mandatory, it's going to be optional, but there will be an option to give an extra amount, recognizing that these are Indigenous stolen lands that you're on, right? So that's what are we doing at a local level? And that's what land back is ultimately about, is to call out colonizers to say it's not this feel-good stuff. Someone's not going to come and steal your home with guns and your truck. It's not that. That's not what land back's about. But it is putting the responsibility on non-Indigenous people to recognize the lie and then stand up and do something about it.
Well, would you say to somebody who's watching this now as if you're a non-indigenous person, what can non-indigenous people do to support reconciliation, land back, these sorts of things?
There's two big things around land back. It's ensuring that there's space there for indigenous people to benefit from their own lands. And the second thing is indigenous people make decisions about their own land. Those are the two big things that we all need to be taking steps to ensure that that happens. So whether it's at a local government level, right? A lot of the things that affect indigenous people are not federal. Often they're not even provincial, they're local. Everyone has a local government. What is your local government doing to ensure that indigenous people aren't just being consulted with? I've done this consultation thing for a long time, not a big fan of it, because they're being consulted about someone else's decision. How are indigenous people exercising their own decisions? How is that being respected? So that can be done at a local level, whether it's through your local government telling them that, whether it's through your church. For those that go to church, there's churches all across the country are redeveloping their land. Well, how are indigenous people deciding about that? How are they participating and benefiting? And then one of the things I tell non-indigenous people is that from my perspective, there's this cruel calculus at work when it comes to motivating politicians. Not all, but most, I think, politicians, whether it's federal or provincial or local, if they think it's just an indigenous issue, they're not a big segment of the population. Probably most of them don't vote. That's the kind of mindset they will often have. If they think that it's moving over, that it's becoming a non-indigenous issue, they start paying a lot more attention. So I really encourage, particularly non-indigenous people, get out there, make politicians aware this is an issue that you're concerned about. It's not just an indigenous one. This is an issue for the entire country, for your province, for your city, and you want to see action, not just apologies, not rhetoric, but action. And hold your politicians to account. And non-indigenous people have a huge role to play in a supportive way, and it can be very effective.
What are your thoughts on the sort of the Coastal GasLink project? If we can get sort of specific, if you're comfortable talking about it, and the Wet'suwet'en Nation. What do you think Canadians need to know about the Coastal GasLink?
So I'm comfortable talking about it. There's a few essays about it in my book, Stand Off, where I talk about this, and I let people know that those are some of my clients. So I've been involved in that. I think there's a couple very important points about that. One is that it's an example of how colonizers will ignore Indigenous laws and Indigenous governance. It really annoyed me to no end when I heard the provincial government and industry going, we've got support. Look, we have these Indian Act bands who have signed up and support the pipeline. It's very important to recognize, first of all, a lot of bands do that just because they've been excluded from benefiting from their lands to begin with. And so their members have been put in really unfair situation. And so what are they supposed to do, right? It's an example, though, of denying title over the land. And because provincial and federal governments continue to deny it, it puts Indigenous people in a very unfair situation. Maybe they'll finally get a few benefits. And to do it, they have to say that they support the pipeline or a mine or hydro dam or something else. So that's one point, I think. The other point is that this was an example, both the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan, because they were the leads in the Supreme Court of Canada decision, the Delgamuukw decision. If anyone was going to be well known to have their own governance system, not Indian Act banned, it was them. And yet the provincial and federal government still fed this line that, we can go talk to the Indian Act bans. The final point is that it's an unfortunate example of how the RCMP becomes a militarized force in Canada for multinational corporations to displace Indigenous people from their lands. This is the 150th anniversary, and it's 150 years of shame. It's not something to be celebrated. What became the RCMP, what began at the Northwest Mounted Police, that was central to Canada's colonization project, removing Indigenous people from the land so non-Indigenous people can exploit it. The RCMP continues to play that role. That's what they do. They're there. You have Indigenous land defenders, usually mostly women. You have these wonderful, powerful women standing up in a nonviolent way to protect the land, and they face militarized police forces that with attack dogs, everything else. I think Canadians need to wake up to that fact. Is that the Canada that you want? Is that the Canada you're proud of? These aren't terrorists. These are land defenders that are standing on principles at the heart of the Canadian Constitution. They're defending the land based on their own laws and based on Canadian law. And this is what they're faced with because provincial and federal governments continue to deny. Oh, you've got a land claim. No. They don't have a land claim. They have land. And they're defending it. And when they do it in a nonviolent way, we have the violence perpetuated against them by the state, by government. And we should all be ashamed of that.
Happy Canada Day.
I was doing an interview a while ago talking about the Pope and a lot of this stuff. And the person interviewing me remarked when we were finished, "How do you laugh so much?" Because I'm always laughing about this. And one of my clients was very good pointing out, laughter is medicine. We need that laughter because this is hard work and it is painful. It is painful for Indigenous people when you think about what's being perpetuated against them, and you'll see people laughing all the time. It's not because it's not important, it's because it hurts so much. And so when you see people laughing about this, I think it's important for non-Indigenous people to recognize that's a sign of the suffering that goes on, and laughter is medicine.
That's it's a great insight to leave it on. Bruce McIvor, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for watching. I know I feel smarter just from having listened to Bruce speak, and he's a super clear thinker, and I'm so grateful that he took the time to speak with me. You can go to the links in the description of this video where you can find more about First Peoples Law, and you can also get a link to Standoff, his book, and I highly recommend you go check it out. And if you want to see more of this kind of content, you can like this video, you could subscribe to the Goose, and if you want to support the Goose, there's a link to our Patreon. No need to do that, but it'd be great if you did. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.